title of Brian's plenary lecture this evening is Cultural Heritage Protection in Zones of Armed Conflict, Lessons Learned and Future Strategies. Please join me in welcoming Professor Brian Rose.
Okay, thank you, Tim. Thanks to all of you for coming tonight. And really, this is a great honor for me to have the opportunity to address you on this subject, which is very much an autobiographical one, because I struggled with how to respond to the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan over the last decade, as did many of you, starting in 2003 when I was president-elect of the AIA. So as I say, the talk to an extent is an autobiographical one because it's a kind of journey for me, as I imagine we all underwent a journey in trying to figure out how we were going to engage with the wars in the Middle East as archaeologists. I should say that I was president of the AIA for 4 years. That nearly killed me because I was dealing with 2 foreign wars and a financial crisis. But that was only 4 years. Tim Harrison has been president of ASOR for 6 years, and so I will ask you to give him a round of applause for that. Because it's not something that everyone would be able to do without suffering a nervous breakdown. Certainly, the wars of the last 10 years had a pronounced impact on our discipline. You see that everywhere you look. And I especially think of this in terms of the titles of academic conferences over the course of the last decade, a few of which I wrote down here. You're all familiar with these. Starting in 2003 and continuing all the way up to the present, you started seeing titles for conferences that dealt with subjects like archaeology of war, archaeology of violence, archaeology of mass destruction, archaeology of mass graves, archaeology of severed heads. I mean, everywhere you looked, there was this new attitude toward what kind of a conference to put together. And at the same time, there was an inclination to see more connections between antiquity and the modern period. And so it wasn't surprising to start seeing comparisons like this one, which is admittedly horrific, but one that I've seen several times. The soldiers on the column of Trajan, the Roman soldiers holding the severed heads of their Dacian or Romanian enemies as war trophies, juxtaposed with an image of the Taliban holding a severed head that still functions as a war trophy. And you see images like this placed under the question, have we changed? Has humankind changed at all in 2,000 years? And in fact, a number of books have been written on that very subject. Are we Rome? Has America become the Roman Empire? And by extension, or in tandem with that, there's been an inclination to see ourselves in the Trojan War or to see the Trojan War in ourselves. So many of you are familiar with the 2 primary examples of that, Achilles in Vietnam or Odysseus in America. Again, tying into this inclination to see stronger links between antiquity and the modern period. And again, that's something that I've noticed increased dramatically in the wake of the war. When destruction has been going on in a lot of countries for a very long period of time, but let me start with the 1990s. As you know, there was a great deal of destruction in Afghanistan in the 1990s, as well as in Iraq in the 1990s. There were rockets that hit the Kabul Archaeological Museum in 1994. You see that on the left. And of course, in the wake of the economic sanctions that were levied on Iraq after the first Gulf War, there was widespread economic depression. A lot of the middle class lost their businesses, they lost their livelihood. And often in a country like this, or really in any country, When the middle class is hit this hard, they'll look for alternate sources of income to feed their families. And of course, that would be their backyards, the fields of Iraq. And so the looting in Iraq, the large-scale looting, really expanded dramatically in the 1990s, although I, for one, was rather unaware of it. I thought all of the looting was in the wake of the 2003 invasion. But when I went to Iraq, the first time I went to Iraq, it was made clear to me by the people there, the antiquities officials and everyone else with whom I spoke, that the mass looting of archaeological sites was something that started in the wake of the sanctions. And so what did we do as archaeological organizations at that time? We didn't do enough. We didn't do much, in fact. We all decried the destruction of cultural property that we saw going on in Iraq and Afghanistan. I certainly was one of them, but at least in my experience, none of us sat down and strategized and tried to say, how can we ameliorate the destruction that we see in so many different countries in this area? And of course, you're seeing the site of Zabalam in southern Iraq on the right, which is the one that's so frequently shown as an example of the mass looting that's occurred in archaeological sites. We didn't really respond, at least from my own experience, until 2003, until the looting of the Iraq Museum in Baghdad, which you see on the screen. And of course, the image on the right is the former director of the Iraq Museum, Donnie George, of course, who left us only a couple years ago, a great tragedy. And in the wake of that looting, there was a clear feeling on the part of archaeologists and archaeological organizations that now we had to respond. The question was, how should we respond? Because we couldn't easily go to Iraq or Afghanistan. The military was there fighting a war. And these were areas to which we couldn't go, we weren't welcomed, and that, of course, was understandable. A war was ongoing. So what should we do? What did we do? There was an inclination on the part of a lot of archaeological organizations in 2003 not to work together. If I had to pinpoint one of our biggest flaws at the beginning of the wars, it would be that we didn't seek out strategic partnerships with each other in North America and even on a global basis. Again, this is a very personal talk, so I'm giving you my personal recollection of what happened, but it seemed to me that every archaeological organization wanted to be able to claim that they had found the solution to the destruction of cultural property throughout the Middle East, that they knew how to respond better than any of the others and would receive the glory that would accrue from the brilliance of that response. And so the result was that we really didn't seek out strategic partnerships in the way that we should have. This all came to me, to my desk, in 2003 when I had become president-elect of the AIA. And Jane Waldbaum, who was the new president of AIA, said to me, "You're going to staff the war desk at AIA. You need to figure out what to do. I have no idea what to do, but figure it out." So I had no idea what to do. Let's remember, as you heard from Tim, I went to a Quaker college. So engaging with the military wasn't something I had ever thought about. It never entered my mind. I mean, I had grown up during the Vietnam War, so obviously images of war were always emblazoned in my mind, but I had no idea what to do. But it was clear to me that if we were to be productive in any significant way, it had to be as a consequence of our dialogue with the archaeologists of Iraq and Afghanistan. It shouldn't be for us to tell them what to do. It should be for them to tell us how we could most profitably make a difference. I should say there was a kind of advisory council to the war desk, and some of you were actually on that. I see Irene Winter here. She was certainly on that council, and several of you were on it as well. And we would meet and we would debate what we could do. The first attempt to respond was our AIA meeting, our annual meeting in 2004, January 2004, where I invited Abdulwasi Firouzi, excuse me, I'm just going to use this, I think. Abdulwasi Firouzi, the director of the Afghanistan Antiquities Service, to come to San Francisco, where the conference was taking place, and to give us some advice. I also invited Donnie George, but his superior at the Iraq Museum had been killed just before the conference, and so he was unable to come. So our primary interaction, and you see the panel that dealt with these issues, our primary interaction was with Abdulwasi Firouzi. And when I sat down with him, I said, how can we most profitably make a difference? And he said, I don't know, but I will tell you what I see as a gap in what's going on. The troops who are deploying to Iraq and Afghanistan, or at least the troops who are deploying to Afghanistan, have no training in the importance of Afghanistan, or for that matter, Iraq, in antiquity, and consequently, they don't see the need to guard with the kind of tenacity we would like to see the archaeological sites, the museums, and the libraries. And so if there's anything you could do to provide that kind of information to them, to show them the great civilizations of Iraq and Afghanistan in antiquity and in subsequent periods, and to teach them why it's so important to devote extra attention, extra diligence to guarding the cultural institutions of these countries. And so I said, why don't we just inaugurate a lecture program wherein AIA archaeologists and other archaeologists of the old world would go to military bases in the US and give lectures that would address the very issues you raise. And he said, fine, do that. So then I said to Jane, how do I do this? And she said, I don't know, you're staffing the war desk, figure it out. So then it became a question of how does one, as an archaeologist or an academic, liaise with the military? And that was a harder issue. Of course, there's a long history of this. During World War II, of course, there was a very strong relationship between academics, between archaeologists, art historians, classicists, historians, and the military. We call them the monuments men, although we should really call them monuments officers because, of course, there were men and women who were charged with safeguarding the cultural heritage of Europe that had been either destroyed or plundered by the Nazis. And you're seeing an image of the so-called monuments men on the left. The one giving the orders is James Rorimer, who later became director of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. So during this period, at the end of World War II, there was a very strong relationship between academia and the military. And that then dissolved after World War II. From what I can see, there was no active involvement of academia with the military in the Korean War in terms of cultural property protection. And then by the time we get to the Vietnam War, that relationship that had been forged so closely and so successfully at the end of World War II crumbled because the academics weren't working with the military, they were marching against them with the students in their classes. So no longer was there a connection between the military and academia. There was an antagonistic relationship that lasted for a very long time, in fact, up to the war. And of course, it lasted into the war. There were plenty of people protesting the war. And there were plenty of people who were saying to us as archaeologists, certainly who were saying to me, do not get involved with the military. This isn't what we're about. Some people felt we should take sides in the war. Others felt we shouldn't take sides in the war. My own feeling was that we should not take any side, any political side in the war. That wasn't our job as archaeologists. Our job was to take sides regarding the protection of the antiquities that were threatened by war, threatened by conflict. And so through a series of discussions, we made the decision to get involved with this training program and to go forward with that, even though, as I say, there were plenty of people, plenty of old world archaeologists who felt that that made us collaborators with the military and thus no different from those they regarded as invaders. Now, again, this was quite a struggle for me because at that point I had accepted a job at Penn and I was eyeing Haverford College and the Quakers of Haverford, and I thought, how would they have felt about this? But it was clear to me there was really no other potentially successful response that we could make. What do we know how to do? Teach and dig. That's what we do. We do a little more, but not a lot more. So we couldn't teach, we couldn't dig, but we could at least teach. We could be a positive force by teaching. Then the question became, how do you do it? How do you put into practice this kind of training program at military bases? And I thought, well, I'll just write a letter to Donald Rumsfeld, who at that point was Secretary of Defense, and present the program. Surely he'll see the wisdom of such a program. He'll thank us for our willingness to do it for free. And of course, that was incredibly naive. It astounds me, even as I say it to you, how naive I was at that point in time. Donald Rumsfeld, of course, didn't answer that letter. He still has not answered it, may I say. And so then I thought, what else can I do? I had gone to graduate school at Columbia with Matthew Bogdanos, who was a Marine Corps colonel and assistant district attorney in Manhattan. Many of you know him. He's famous not just for being a Marine Corps colonel and for having written a rather famous book, Thieves of Baghdad, but for having played a critical role in repatriating some of the antiquities that had been plundered from the Iraq Museum. And you see some of those returned antiquities on the right, as well as Matthew with an ice chest in which was contained the so-called Worka vase, and the Worka vase in the ice chest, and then, of course, as it once was, in the center. He's also famous for having prosecuted Puff Daddy. But I hadn't spoken to him in a very long period of time. We had gone to different parties in graduate school. And so, in a way of speaking, façon de parler. And so I wasn't sure if he even would remember who I was, but through a friend of a friend of a friend, I got his home phone number and just called him out of the blue and said, I need your help in getting this program approved. I think it's worthwhile. I think we have to do it. The Department of Defense is not doing it for pre-deployment training, but I have no idea how to do it. And he was terrific. He not only remembered me, which is extraordinary because it had been 35 years-ish, but he said, I'll help you do it. And he just laughed when I said I had written to Donald Rumsfeld, and he said, that won't work. You need to write to General Abizaid at the U.S. Central Command, and I'll help shepherd the proposal through the proper channels. And so he did that, and 9 months after we proposed the program, it was accepted. But then I had to figure out how to put it in place in the bases where we were going to do the training. The fact that the U.S. Central, I thought it was like an academic model. You know, I was viewing the military as if it was a university, which of course it is not. So I thought if the president of the university said, make this happen, all the base commanders would say, fine, here's the auditorium, come anytime. And of course, the military doesn't work like that. You know, what did I know about the military? I watched Gomer Pyle when I was a child. That's it. That's really it. That's all I knew. And so I needed to be educated by Matthew in how a military base worked and how you approached the base commander to get permission to do these kinds of lectures. And Matthew was of great help to me there, too. And so gradually we expanded the program. We started at Camp Lejeune in North Carolina, the Marine Corps base at Camp Lejeune, and expanded to the Army base at Fort Bliss and the Air Force base at Fort Dix in central New Jersey, where I still do these briefings. I've been doing them for 9 years. You see me in upper right at the first of these venues, the first time I did it, which was at Camp Lejeune. The base commanders asked me to give it to them first because although I had said that the briefings would be politically neutral, how did they know this? I could, in theory, be a latter-day Jane Fonda. There was no way they could have assessed this. And so you see me, I mean, I'm wearing tweed, which is, of course, what our people wear, and they're wearing fatigues. They had gotten the entire room fixed up overnight. So new carpeting, they had painted the room where I was scheduled to lecture. There were new paintings on the wall. They were paintings of battle, but they were new. When I said, you know, at Penn, it would take 6 months to have this done. And they said, well, we're the Marines. We do things immediately. And the troops to whom I lectured were incredibly interested in everything I had to say. I can't say enough good words about the troops and about their questions. And they immediately responded to the lectures that we were giving. And I should say, I wasn't alone in giving them by any means. I saw Elise Friedland here tonight. She gave one of the lectures at Camp Lejeune. Al Leonard, I saw earlier today, gave lectures at Fort Bliss. I didn't want to do it all by myself, nor was it possible to do it all by myself. I needed to assemble a platoon, as it were, of archaeologists who could do this. Not every archaeologist whom I corralled into doing this, I should say, loved it. Remember, and I'm preaching to the converted here, as you know, when you go on a lecture tour, people are very nice to you. And they take you out to dinner, they put you in a nice hotel, they treat you in a special way. The military is not like that. And so I found that some archaeologists were expecting a slightly different treatment from the military than they received. So what I started doing was picking archaeologists to do the briefings who had already seen military service themselves, either before or during Vietnam. So for example, Paul Zemansky did a few of them, Jim Wright, Al Leonard I mentioned earlier, because they knew what the military was, what to expect, and what not to expect. And I should also say that there were a number of others who were exploring the same topics that I was from a slightly different angle, and we all found each other. And so you see one of those, Laurie Rush, whom you see with me in Baghdad with Diane Seabrandt on the left. This is a lower right slide, but Diane Seabrandt on the left, the former cultural heritage liaison at the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad. All of us who were concerned about finding strategic ways to protect cultural property ultimately came together. Corey Wegner, the head of Blue Shield, is another example. It took about a year for this to happen, but ultimately it did. And the problem that I found was that at least initially, we were given very little time to do the briefings. There were times at Fort Bliss where I had 20 minutes. So 20 minutes, with this group in particular, you'll understand the challenge. 20 minutes to convey the history and archaeology of both Iraq and Afghanistan, as well as do's and don'ts in the field, as well as the fundamentals of historic preservation. 20 minutes. So how to handle Mudbrick, because of course many of the troops were deploying to southern Afghanistan, where the monumental architecture, of course, is Mudbrick, southern Iraq with monumental Mudbrick architecture, or to Afghanistan, where you find the same thing. What do you do when you enter a museum that has been hit by a rocket 5 minutes before? How do you respond? You need to respond quickly. What do you do? What don't you do? If you're expanding a military base, you're building a new room onto a base, you dig down, you see that the soil is changing color, it could be mud brick, you stop immediately, you alert your commanding officer, you dig somewhere else. The importance of remote sensing to ensure that you're not digging somewhere where there's an ancient site, how to recognize an ancient site. All right, so I just did all that in 5 minutes, but we only had 20 initially, and gradually we were given more and more time to a point where ultimately we would get the entire morning. And there have been times I've had the entire day. If we have the entire day, then I bring someone from the American Institute of Conservation, or Laurie Rush, or Corey Wegner to give the Blue Shield or Civil Affairs point of view. We give them a wide variety of viewpoints regarding the protection of cultural property. And Laurie developed a series of playing cards which are intended to reinforce all the lessons that we were giving the troops during the pre-deployment training. And so you see a few of them. Do not buy antiquities. The money that you give to those who are selling antiquities will immediately go to the insurgents who are trying to kill you. Do not buy these antiquities. Or one of my favorites, how would we feel if someone destroyed the torch of the Statue of Liberty? It's the same sense of loss and destruction, violence in a way that the residents of Iraq and Afghanistan feel when their cultural heritage is destroyed. These have been very successful, and these are given out to all troops who deploy. They were given out to all troops who deployed to Iraq. They're still given out to all troops who deployed to Afghanistan. There's a question, of course, as to what constitutes cultural property. I'll come back to that several times. The last time I was in Afghanistan, in southern Afghanistan, I was doing some of these lectures 2 years ago, and really it's Elise Friedland who was responsible for that trip to Afghanistan. So you see me here in southern Afghanistan. And the day before my last day during that trip to Afghanistan was the day that the minister in Florida burned a copy of the Quran, and the country of Afghanistan found out about it the next day. That was the day I was leaving. And of course, a lot of people then were killed. There were UN officials who were killed. There were plenty of Afghans who were killed. There were riots all over the country. And it really reinforced in me the necessity of getting to children before they learn to hate. And this is something that we've been slow to learn. It's great fun to teach to teach university-level students, even more fun to teach graduate students. We tend to forget about primary schools and secondary schools, but they're just as important arenas for us as the university levels. We need to reach the children before they've been taught to be intolerant of other cultures, before they've been taught to hate other cultures and other people associated with those cultures. AIA responded in a way by putting up lesson plans for primary school teachers that reinforced respect for a wide variety of cultures. But I think we need to do even more than that. People like us need to be going to primary schools and emphasizing these points over and over again. It might prevent one fewer book from being burned in the future and several fewer deaths from occurring as a consequence of those burnings. Of course, the destruction that we've seen in the last 10 years hasn't just been restricted to combat areas. In Turkey, which is where I've been working for the last 33 years, especially in the last 10 years, there's been a phenomenal increase in the destruction of archaeological sites. One of the reasons for that, I suppose, is that the economy in Turkey is booming. I don't quite know why, but it's one of the strongest economies in the Near East, and so there's new road construction everywhere. If there's road construction, then there's equipment for road construction everywhere, and that equipment, those front-end loaders, can be used to plunder sites in the evening, and that has happened. More recently, I've seen an upswing in lootings to order, or what I would call lootings to order, lootings of objects, monuments, artifacts that are so famous that they could never be sold on the art market. So there must have been an order put in for the looting, and this is one of the most egregious examples. As many of you know, Karaburun, which is what I'm showing you on the screen, is a site in Lycia in southwestern Turkey that was dug by Makteld Melik of Bryn Mawr College, especially in the early 70s, late 60s, early 70s. And she found a wonderful painted tomb dating to 470 BC, more or less, featuring the deceased man on a kline. You see him on upper right, and then you see him the way he looks today. He's gone. So 2 years ago, a group of looters came in, obviously with conservators, because it's not easy to take an entire painting off a wall, and they stripped the tomb of that painting. And where is it now? I have no idea. It's in someone's basement, being used as a component in a dinner party, I suppose. There was no paint on the ground next to the looting, next to the destruction of the painting. So they didn't destroy the painting in the context of in the course of the looting. They took it, as mosaics are so frequently taken these days. And that too requires conservators. So we're seeing the looters far better equipped, far better educated than ever before, and reaching out to form the kinds of strategic partnerships that we should have been forming in 2003. Of course, we've also seen the antiquities that have been looted recently and even a long time ago, constituting the source or the centerpiece of trials and of increasingly vehement attempts to seek the repatriation of those antiquities. And you see, of course, the famous Euphronius crater, which was recently repatriated to Italy, now in the Villa Giulia Museum from the Metropolitan Museum. And when these antiquities return, they're greeted as analogous to the Homeric heroes who have returned after their wanderings following the Trojan War. You see here the cover of the antiquities, the repatriated antiquities catalog recently produced in Italy, and the antiquities themselves are called nostoi. So they're referred to as the Homeric heroes who have experienced this homecoming. That's the way they're viewed. After a very labyrinthine journey, they finally come home. And more blogs blogs associated with antiquities are also appearing on the internet, wherein the antiquities speak in first person. I am Greek and I want to go home, in the case of the antiquities from Athens that are now in the British Museum, the so-called Elgin marbles. What's interesting about this is that the UNESCO Convention of 1970, which we were always taught was a line in the sand on which we could rely, is really no longer in force. This is a new development, and it's one that I recently experienced in my capacity as a curator at the Penn Museum. As some of you know, we had a hoard of gold jewelry, 24 pieces of gold jewelry of early Bronze Age date, about 2400 BC, very similar in style and workmanship to the kind of jewelry that Heinrich Schliemann found at Troy in 1873, bought by the Penn Museum in 1966. And at the time it was bought, it was published by George Bass, who was a curator of the Penn Museum at that point. George said, I can't tell whether it was smuggled from an area that is now Greece or now Turkey, because the jewelry that makes up the hoard is similar in style, both to the treasure, the so-called treasure of Priam from Troy, and to the gold jewelry of early Bronze Age date from Polyokni on Lemnos. You're seeing the Trojan gold with the Penn example on the left, and the Polyokni gold with comparable Penn examples on the right. As a consequence, one couldn't prove from what country it had originally been looted, although it was clear to all of us that it had been looted. It gave rise, in fact, to the so-called Pennsylvania Declaration, which we passed in 1970, where we pledged as a museum not to buy any antiquity that did not have a known place of origin and proof of legality of export. And following that very quickly were the International Council of Museums statement on antiquities purchase, and then, of course, the UNESCO Convention. This gold, though, was inspected by my colleague from Troy, Ernst Pernichka, 3 years ago, and he found a tiny grain of sand in the back of the gold, which embedded in one of the pendants, which upon analysis proved to be extraordinarily high in arsenic, comparable to the high levels of arsenic of the soil of Troy. And so that was viewed as a kind of smoking gun, which was subsequently reported in the Philadelphia Inquirer and other newspapers, and subsequently there was a claim for repatriation from Turkey. And one of the things I said was, but the museum bought this in 1966. That was 4 years before the UNESCO Convention. And they said, we're going by the Ottoman Antiquities Law of 1906. So we don't pay any attention to UNESCO to 1970 any longer. That was new to me. That was one of the few anchors on which I thought our careers or our points of view could rely. But that is now fading away. And in short, we agreed to send the gold to Turkey on indefinite loan, which they accepted in return for strong support for our field projects in Turkey and long-term loans from Turkey to the Penn Museum. What we also see in conjunction with this are museums as arguments, new museums as arguments for the repatriation of antiquities. You're all familiar, of course, with the new Acropolis Museum in Athens, where gaps have been left, almost like the empty thrones of antiquity, that will one day be filled by the Elgin marbles that are currently in the British Museum, and the same sort of thing will be done for the new Troy Museum, which construction of which just started a couple weeks ago. And all of this has given rise to questions of who owns antiquity. To quote the now famous book by Jim Cuno, are we to ascribe the ownership rights to the country of origin, or is the question a different one that can be addressed in a different way and less restrictive? And that's something, of course, that we and all of our students are still discussing. But in tandem with all of these questions, we've certainly seen a dramatic increase in nationalism. And with that increase in nationalism, we've seen a tendency to cohere around ancient symbols as a kind of nucleus of the newly nationalistic society. And I don't want to imply that America is exempt from this. All of you remember what happened after 9/11. American flags grew to 100 times their former size. People couldn't carry them anymore, they were so big. This was certainly one of the symbols of nationalism, and you see that everywhere you look. Again, focused in many cases on ancient symbols. So 2 examples from Skopje in the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia, where it seems every other complex is now named Alexander the Great, and a colossal statue of Alexander on Bucephalus has now been erected in the center of Skopje. And then I'm showing that with a 25,000 dinar note from Iraq, where, as you'll see, it's Hammurabi and Shamash on the reverse of the currency. And we've seen that, too, in the demonstrations that have occurred in so many different countries. I'm showing you examples here from 2010 and 2011, the demonstrations in Peru urging Yale to repatriate the antiquities that they viewed as having been stolen from Machu Picchu 90 years before. And then, of course, the human chain around the Cairo Museum, the Cairo Archaeological Museum, during the civil wars of a few years ago, trying to protect those antiquities from the same kind of damage that befell the antiquities in the Iraq Museum. One of the things we're seeing in these increased claims for repatriation is a stronger arm, a stronger hand, a stronger hammer that's being used as a point of leverage. So one of the most common examples is the request for repatriation of the Sphinx from Boğazköy, from Hattusha, the Hittite Sphinx that was in the Pergamon Museum in Berlin. And only a few years ago, Turkey asked for Berlin, for Germany to repatriate it, and Germany said no, and then Turkey said, if you ever want to work in our country again, you will repatriate this Sphinx. So this was new, at least in my experience, this kind of leverage used against a country as an argument for repatriation. And in fact, 1 month, more or less, after Turkey made this statement, Germany did agree to repatriate the Sphinx, and it is now again in central Turkey. I mentioned earlier the question about what is cultural property and what should be protected. In some cases, it's very easy to know what should be protected. If something is 2,000 years old, of course it should be protected. What if it's not 2,000 years old? What if it's 20 years old? What about the statues of Saddam Hussein, for example, or the images of any of the dictators of recent times? And I'm showing you, of course, the colossal head of Ferdinand Marcos of the Philippines, carved in one of the cliffs of the Philippines, before and after the iconoclasm, the bombing of the orbital region of the sculpture, which gives it an especially eerie appearance. And of course, all of the images of Saddam Hussein have come down, and shortly after that, there was an order in Spain to take down all of the images of Franco, of the General Franco. And this has happened, of course, in many places, even in Turkmenistan, with the images of Turkmenbashi. Should these be protected, or should we take a stand on the protection of these images? My feeling is yes. My feeling is that if these images cause hatred or destruction or anger or racism or violence, if they've been associated with those concepts, take them down, put them in a museum, and put up a sign that indicates how they have been used to stir those kinds of emotions, but don't destroy them. I felt the same way when I was in southern Iraq at the site of Ur, where I was looking at the so-called House of Abraham in Ur with Diane Seabrandt from the embassy in Baghdad and Abdulamir Hamdani, who may well be here tonight. He's a graduate student of Elizabeth Stone's and Paul Zemansky's at SUNY Stony Brook now. And we were discussing the House of Abraham. Now, as many of you know, there's very little antiquity in the House of Abraham. The foundations of some of the rooms are allegedly ancient, but in general, this house was built by Saddam Hussein in 1999 because he knew that the Pope would be making pilgrimages the following year, 2000, in conjunction with the Jubilee year, the Vatican's Jubilee year. He had said he would go to biblical sites on a pilgrimage. So Saddam Hussein built up a House of Abraham to attract the Pope to Ur, knowing that if the Pope Pope came, that his reputation would conceivably rise as a consequence, and so would Iraq's. And of course, the Pope didn't come, but meanwhile, the House of Abraham stands as a kind of 40-room mansion that in fact echoes the giant houses of Saddam Hussein himself. And Abdul Amir said to me, I want this destroyed because it's a creation of political propaganda. And I said, this is part of the biography of the site now. It's part of the site's history. It shows that the site has been used in the services of political propaganda, so don't destroy it. Put up a sign that indicates how it has been used to promote a kind of political propaganda, but destruction will prompt nothing. And you see from our body language the difference in our viewpoints. I'm appealing to him in a very kind of Quakerly way, as I've just appealed to you, and Abdul Amir is standing with his arms crossed across his chest and indicated to me that he wanted it destroyed, although as far as I know it still stands. But these are the questions that we now have to face. What is cultural property? What should be saved? In some cases, it's clear what should be saved. As I say, something like the Bamiyan Buddhas, this was viewed as a horrific act by virtually everyone across the globe. This is also, of course, a conundrum for us. What do we do when the rulers of a country decide to destroy their own cultural property, as was the case here? We don't have a clear answer for that. But there are a lot of ways in which we have advanced. One of the things I'd like to mention is the International Council of Museums Red List of Antiquities at Risk. These publications that are produced whenever there is armed conflict in a particular region or cause to worry about the destruction of cultural property in a particular region. They will showcase the kinds of antiquities that have been looted or are currently being looted so that the customs agents in a variety of countries know what to look for. The military is also better now at preparing troops for engagement with cultural property than they were in 2003. And a good deal of this is due to the heroic efforts of Laurie Rush. At some military bases, there are now replica archaeological sites with which the troops have to practice prior to deployment so that they become more sensitized to the risks and what to do and what not to do when they come into contact with monuments or cultural property that's 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 years old. The lectures that I give have decreased in number. Of course, that's in part because we're no longer deploying to Iraq, and the deployments to Afghanistan have decreased. So since in the last year, I think I've only given 4, whereas in earlier days I would have given easily 8 or sometimes 12. But my hope is that the 2008 decision of the U.S. to finally ratify the Hague Convention regarding the protection of cultural property in instances of armed conflict will prompt the Secretary of Defense to require cultural heritage training as a mandatory component of pre-deployment training, which currently it isn't. We're also better at working together, as we were not in 2003. I've continually mentioned these strategic partnerships. Now we have them at least more extensively than we did then. So AIA and ASOR now occupy the same building in Boston, which leads to greater interaction on programs. We've signed an agreement with the Russian Academy of Sciences, the German Archaeological Institute, the Institute of Archaeology in China, so that we will speak with one voice when cultural property is at risk again. Because when cultural property was at risk in 2003, it was almost like the Tower of Babel. You heard 100 different voices saying 100 different things. We need to say one thing as a kind of United Nations of archaeologists if we're to be effective. And we need to work in tandem with organizations like the Blue Shield, the cultural equivalent of the Red Cross, as we are currently doing. In some cases, there have been new institutes focused on training the Iraqis and the Afghans in cultural heritage protection and new techniques in conservation. One of the key ones is the Iraq Institute for the Conservation of Antiquities and Heritage in Erbil in northern Iraq, which focuses on training Iraqi conservators, and that's been in business and functioning extraordinarily well for the last 3 or 4 years. I always end my lectures with this image, which is a photo of the Kabul Archaeological Museum in 2001, right after the Taliban were pushed out of the country. A bilingual inscription that says, "A nation stays alive when its culture stays alive." And this is something that I think we can never forget, and it's something that all of you are doing, though you may not realize it, through everything you do in your professions, whether it's in the classroom, whether it's in the museum, whether it's in the field. You are playing a critical role in keeping so many different cultures alive, and thus the nations associated with those cultures. So thank you for that, and thank you for listening to me tonight. Thank you.